A millionaire adopts a homeless black girl, hoping to give her a second chance at life. For 3 years, he watches her grow, thrive, and become the daughter he never knew he needed. But just when everything seems perfect, the phone rings, and what he hears on the other end shatters everything he thought he knew. Because the girl he rescued isn't just any child. She carries a past he was never supposed to uncover. What is the shocking truth behind her story? And how will it change both of their lives forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The winter wind whipped around Elliot Grayson as he stepped out of his Tesla Model S, his perfectly tailored suit offering little protection against the biting cold. Snowflakes danced in the glow of the street lamps, coating the sidewalks of downtown with a thin white blanket. He checked his Rolex, still 45 minutes before he needed to be at the Metropolitan Hotel for his speech at the annual Tech Innovation Charity Gala. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he gazed at the brick building across the street. Hope Harbor. Women and Children's Shelter wasn't much to look at, but Elliot knew the vital work they did. His foundation had been supporting them for years, though he rarely visited in person. Something drew him toward the entrance tonight. Maybe it was the way the warm light spilled from the windows, creating golden rectangles on the snow. Or maybe it was just a need to remind himself why he gave these speeches in the first place. The front desk volunteer's eyes widened with recognition as he walked in. "Mr. Grayson, we weren't expecting you tonight." "Just thought I'd stop by," Elliot said with a gentle smile, shrugging off his coat. The shelter's heating system hummed steadily, fighting against the December chill. "Mind if I look around?" "Of course not. Most of the families are in the dining hall for dinner right now." Elliot nodded and walked down the hallway, his expensive shoes quiet against the worn linoleum floor. Past the dining hall's open door, he could hear the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation. But something else caught his attention, a slice of light from the small library room. He peered inside. The room was empty except for a small figure hunched over a book at one of the tables. A girl, maybe just 6 or 8 years old, sat completely absorbed in her reading. The book looked like it had seen better days, its spine held together with clear tape, but she handled it with careful reverence. What struck Elliot most was her posture, straight-backed and composed, like a scholar in a university library rather than a child in a homeless shelter. Her dark curls were neatly pulled back, and though her clothes were clearly well worn, they were clean and tidy. "Hello there," Elliot said softly, not wanting to startle her. The girl looked up, her brown eyes sharp and assessing. She didn't smile, but she didn't look afraid either. Instead, she studied him with an intensity that made him feel like he was the one being evaluated. "Hello?" she replied, her voice clear and steady. Elliot gestured to the chair across from her. "Mind if I join you?" She considered this for a moment, then gave a small nod. As Elliot sat down, he caught sight of the book's title, A Children's Encyclopedia About Space. "That's a big book for someone your age," he commented. "It's interesting," she said. "I don't understand all of it yet, but I will." There was no childish boasting in her tone, just simple determination. Elliot found himself smiling. "I'm Elliot. What's your name?" "Zara," she answered, marking her place in the book with a scrap of paper. "Zara Toussaint." "Nice to meet you, Zara. Do you like science?" "I like learning," she said. "Science, math, history, anything that helps explain how things work and why they are the way they are." The way she spoke, careful, precise, almost adult-like, intrigued Elliot even more. Before he could respond, the shelter manager, Mrs. Smith, appeared in the doorway. "Oh, Mr. Grayson, I see you've met our resident scholar," she said warmly. "Zara, honey, dinner's getting cold." "Just 5 more minutes?" Zara asked, her composure slipping slightly to reveal the child beneath. Mrs. Smith's face softened. "Okay, 5 minutes, but then you need to eat." After she left, Elliot turned back to Zara. "You come here to read often?" "Every chance I get," Zara said. "It's quieter than the main room and the books." She trailed off, running her fingers along the worn cover. "They take you places, you know. Something in her voice made Elliot's heart twist. He'd heard that Mrs. Smith was excellent at her job, but he suddenly wanted to know more about this remarkable child. He excused himself and found Mrs. Smith in her office. "How long has Zara been here?" he asked without preamble. Mrs. Smith's expression grew serious. "About 8 months now. It's a difficult situation. Her mother was imprisoned on drug charges, but..." She lowered her voice. "Between you and me, the evidence was shaky at best. Typical story. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong skin color. No father in the picture, no relatives willing or able to take her in." Elliot felt a familiar anger stir in his chest. He'd seen too many lives derailed by a justice system that seemed to have forgotten the justice part. "She's incredible," Mrs. Smith continued. "Straight A's despite changing schools 3 times this year. Never complains, helps the younger kids with their homework. But she's so guarded. Can't blame her, really. The system hasn't given her much reason to trust it." Elliot thanked her and walked back to the library, but Zara had already gone to dinner. He stood there for a moment, looking at the empty chair where she'd sat, the tattered book still on the table. Later that night, after delivering his speech at the gala, Elliot sat in his home office, his untouched glass of scotch catching the light from his desk lamp. His laptop displayed various pages about the foster care system, each tab revealing more disturbing statistics about outcomes for Black children in the system. He thought about Zara, reading physics in a shelter library, refusing to let her circumstances define her future. He thought about his own mentor, Charles Toussaint, who had given him his first break in the tech industry 20 years ago. Charles, who had worked twice as hard to get half as far, who had taught Elliot about business, but had never fully shared the weight of what it meant to be Black in America. The question formed in his mind, impossible to ignore. If not me, then who? He looked at the time, nearly midnight. Tomorrow he would make some calls. Tomorrow he would start the process. But for now, he sat in his quiet office, knowing that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The adoption process moved at a glacial pace, each day bringing new challenges that tested Elliot's resolve. Social workers came and went, their clipboards filled with endless questions and concerns. The main social worker, Ms. Patterson, a stern-faced woman with wire-rimmed glasses, didn't bother hiding her skepticism. "Mr. Grayson," she said during their 3rd meeting, her pen tapping against her notepad, "while your financial resources are impressive, raising a child, particularly a Black child, requires more than just money. Have you considered the cultural implications?" Elliot sat straight in his chair, his hands clasped on the conference room table. "I have. I'm also aware that I have much to learn. But what Zara needs most right now is stability, support, and someone who believes in her potential." Ms. Patterson's eyes narrowed. "And you think you're qualified to provide that?" "I think Zara deserves a chance at a better life," Elliot replied firmly, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to give her that chance." The meetings continued, each one feeling like a cross-examination. Elliot hired the best adoption attorney in the city, filled out countless forms, and underwent background checks. He renovated one of his penthouse's spare rooms, transforming it into a space worthy of a young girl, though he left the major decorating decisions for Zara to make herself. During supervised visits, Elliot and Zara spent time together at the shelter. He brought her books about famous Black scientists and mathematicians, watching her eyes light up as she discovered new role models. They played chess, and she surprised him by winning their 3rd game. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, staring at the checkmate she'd cleverly set up. Zara shrugged, but her pride showed through. "Mr. Williams at my old school had a chess club. He said I had a good mind for strategy." Finally, after what felt like endless weeks of scrutiny and paperwork, the day arrived. Zara stood in the shelter's office, holding a small duffel bag that contained everything she owned in the world. Mrs. Chen hugged her goodbye, tears in her eyes. "You take care of yourself, scholar," Mrs. Chen whispered. The drive to the penthouse was quiet. Zara sat in the back seat of Elliot's Mercedes, her bag clutched tightly in her lap, watching the city transform from familiar rundown buildings to gleaming high-rises. When they pulled into the underground parking garage, her eyes widened at the row of luxury cars. "Are these all yours?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just this one and the Tesla over there," Elliot replied, trying to sound casual. "The others belong to neighbors." The private elevator ride to the top floor felt endless. When the doors opened directly into the penthouse, Zara froze. The space before her seemed to stretch forever, all clean lines and modern furniture, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Mrs. Connors, Elliot's housekeeper, stood waiting, her hands clasped in front of her crisp black dress. "Welcome home, Miss Zara," she said, her tone professional but uncertain. Zara nodded silently, still clutching her bag. "Let me show you your room," Elliot said, leading the way down a hallway. The bedroom he'd prepared was spacious and bright, with a queen-sized bed, a desk, and built-in bookshelves waiting to be filled. "This is all mine?" Zara asked, looking overwhelmed. "All yours. We can decorate it however you'd like." But Zara just stood there, her bag still in her hands, looking small against the vast emptiness of the room. "Would you like help unpacking?" Mrs. Connors offered. "No, thank you," Zara said quickly. "I can do it myself." But hours later, when Mrs. Connors brought dinner to Zara's room, the bag remained untouched by the door. The next few days fell into an uncomfortable routine. Ms. Winters, the private tutor Elliot hired, arrived each morning at 9. Despite Zara's perfect grades, Elliot thought extra support would help her adjust to her new school. "I don't need a tutor," Zara insisted during their third session, frustration clear in her voice. "I was doing fine before." "It's not about need," Elliot tried to explain. "It's about giving you every advantage." "I don't want advantages," Zara cut him off. "I want—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Mrs. Connors moved through the penthouse like a ghost, cleaning and cooking with quiet efficiency. She was unfailingly polite to Zara, but maintained a careful distance, as if unsure whether to treat her as a guest or a member of the household. Dinner became a nightly exercise in awkward attempts at conversation. Elliot would ask about her day, and Zara would answer in short, polite sentences that revealed nothing. The clink of silverware against expensive china seemed too loud in the silence. One evening, Elliot suggested they go shopping for new clothes. "You must be tired of wearing the same things," he said, noting her worn jeans and faded t-shirt. "My clothes are fine," Zara replied, pushing her food around her plate. "They're clean and they fit." "But wouldn't you like something new? We could go to any store you want." "No, thank you." Her voice was firm, final. That night, unable to sleep, Elliot walked past Zara's room and noticed the door slightly ajar. He peered in, expecting to find her asleep in the big bed. Instead, he found her curled up on the floor beside it, wrapped in the shelter blanket she'd brought with her, her breathing deep and even. The sight stopped him cold. Here he was, offering her everything money could buy, while she slept on the floor rather than the expensive mattress he'd chosen. Her duffel bag still sat by the door, ready for a quick escape if needed. Elliot stood there watching his daughter sleep and realized how naive he'd been. He'd thought his resources could smooth over any difficulty, that providing material comfort would naturally lead to emotional security. But Zara's entire life had taught her that nothing was permanent, that everything could be taken away in an instant. $1,000 spent on clothes wouldn't make her feel at home. A private tutor couldn't teach her to trust. The spacious penthouse, with all its luxury and silence, might as well be a foreign country to her. She needed something money couldn't buy. She needed to believe that this time, this home, this family, wouldn't disappear like all the others. Weeks turned into a rhythm of new routines. Zara began to venture out of her room more, though she still kept her duffel bag packed. She started eating breakfast at the kitchen counter instead of in her room, and sometimes she'd even share small details about her day with Mrs. Connors, who gradually warmed to her presence. The morning of her first day at Westbrook Academy arrived with a crisp September chill. Zara stood in front of her mirror, tugging at the required uniform, a navy blazer with the school crest, a pleated skirt, and polished shoes that still felt stiff. Her hair was pulled back neatly, every strand in place. "Ready?" Elliot asked, appearing in her doorway. Zara nodded, though her fingers twisted the strap of her new leather backpack. The drive to school was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled up to Westbrook's imposing brick buildings and manicured lawns, Zara's breath caught slightly. "You'll do great," Elliot assured her, squeezing her shoulder gently. But as Zara walked through Westbrook's halls, she felt the stares. Students whispered behind their hands, their eyes following her every move. In her first class, Advanced English, she was the only black student in the room. The teacher, Mrs. Harrison, barely glanced at her as she introduced herself. The real trouble started 2 weeks later, when Mrs. Harrison handed back their first major essays. Zara had written about the parallels between modern social media and the themes of surveillance in 1984. She'd worked hard on it, staying up late to perfect every paragraph. Mrs. Harrison held Zara's paper back after distributing the others. "Miss Toussaint Grayson, could you stay after class?" When the other students filed out, Mrs. Harrison peered at Zara over her reading glasses. "This essay," she said, tapping the paper, "it's quite sophisticated. Perhaps too sophisticated for a student at your level." Zara's chest tightened. "I wrote it myself." "Are you certain you didn't have excessive help? Perhaps from a tutor?" "No," Zara said firmly, her hands clenching under the desk. "Every word is mine." Mrs. Harrison's lips pursed. "Well, we'll need to schedule a meeting with your father to discuss this." During lunch period, Zara sat alone, pushing her food around her plate. A group of girls approached her table, led by Claire Henderson, whose designer bag probably cost more than everything Zara owned before Elliot. "Mind if we sit?" Claire asked, not waiting for an answer before sliding onto the bench. "So, what was it like before? You know, before Mr. Grayson took you in?" Zara kept her eyes on her food. "What do you mean?" "Well, were you like really poor? Did you live in one of those dangerous neighborhoods?" "That's none of your business," Zara replied coldly. Claire leaned forward, her voice dropping to a stage whisper. "I just think it's so amazing what Mr. Grayson did. Like, taking in someone like you and giving you all these opportunities. I didn't think girls like you were usually this smart." The words hit Zara like a physical blow. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Girls like me?" "Oh, don't be so sensitive," Claire said, waving her hand dismissively. It was a compliment. That evening, Zara sat at the dinner table, pushing her salmon around while Elliot talked about his day. Finally, she interrupted him. "Mrs. Harrison thinks I cheated on my essay." Elliot's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What? Why would she think that?" "She said it was too sophisticated for someone at my level." Zara's voice cracked slightly. "And Claire Henderson said she didn't think girls like me were usually smart." "Oh," Elliot said, setting down his fork. "Well, I'm sure Mrs. Harrison was just surprised by your ability, and Claire probably didn't mean it that way." "Didn't mean it what way?" Zara's voice rose. "Racist?" "Because that's exactly what she meant." "Zara," Elliot said gently, "sometimes people say things without thinking. It doesn't always mean—" "Never mind," Zara cut him off, pushing away from the table. "You don't understand." The following weekend, Elliot hosted a dinner party for his business associates. He'd asked Zara to attend, hoping to help her feel more integrated into his world. She wore a new dress that Mrs. Connors had helped her pick out, her hair styled elegantly. The evening started smoothly enough. Zara answered questions about school politely, though she noticed how some guests seemed surprised by her articulate responses. Then Mr. Peterson, one of Elliot's older colleagues, cornered them by the appetizer table. "Elliot," he said, swirling his wineglass, "I've been meaning to ask. With all the children in need of homes, why didn't you adopt someone more?" He paused, eyes flicking to Zara. "Culturally similar." The room seemed to freeze. Zara turned to Elliot, waiting for him to respond, to defend her, to say something, anything. But Elliot stood there, mouth slightly open, caught in a moment of shocked silence that stretched too long. Mr. Peterson filled the silence with an uncomfortable laugh. "Just curious, you understand. Must be quite an adjustment for everyone." Finally, Elliot managed, Well, that's not— Excuse us." He guided Zara away with a hand on her shoulder, but the damage was done. Later that night, after the guests had left, Elliot knocked on Zara's door. "Can we talk about what happened?" Silence answered him. "Zara, please. I know I should have said something right away. I was just caught off guard." More silence. "I'm sorry," he said to the closed door. "I really am." Inside her room, Zara sat on the floor, back against her bed, still in her party dress. Tears slid down her cheeks as she stared at her duffel bag, still packed after all these weeks. She'd thought things would be different here, that money and privilege would shield her from the pain she'd known before. But some things, she was learning, money couldn't fix. In the hallway, Elliot pressed his forehead against the door. He thought about all the times he'd dismissed Zara's concerns, all the microaggressions he'd explained away. He'd been so focused on providing for her material needs that he'd failed to protect her from these subtle, cutting forms of racism. His silence tonight had spoken volumes, and he realized with growing horror that by trying to minimize these incidents, he'd become part of the problem. The morning sun cast long shadows across Zara's untouched breakfast plate. Elliot sat at the kitchen counter, watching her door remain firmly closed, his heart heavy with the weight of his failure. He'd tried knocking earlier, but she hadn't responded. Mrs. Connors moved quietly around the kitchen, casting concerned glances between them. "She didn't touch her toast," Mrs. Connors said softly, removing the cold plate. Elliot nodded, his coffee growing cold in front of him. His phone buzzed with meeting notifications, but for once, work wasn't his priority. He couldn't stop replaying last night's events. His silence in the face of Mr. Peterson's racist comment, the hurt in Zara's eyes, the way she'd turned away from him. Instead of heading to the office, Elliot retreated to his study. He opened his laptop, but instead of checking emails, he typed "understanding racial bias" into the search bar. Hours passed as he dove deeper into articles, studies, and personal accounts. His eyes widened as he read about microaggressions, all the subtle ways racism manifested in daily life, so many of which he'd dismissed when Zara tried to tell him. He found himself taking notes, his hand shaking slightly as he recognized patterns in his own behavior. How many times had he told her, "They didn't mean it that way," when she pointed out racist comments? How often had he prioritized his comfort over her reality? By afternoon, his desk was covered in printouts about white privilege, transracial adoption, and the importance of acknowledging racial identity. His phone contained newly downloaded podcasts by Black parents and educators. Each new piece of information made him more aware of his own blindness. That evening, after another silent dinner, Elliot knocked on Zara's door again. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. "Really talk this time?" There was a long pause before he heard movement. The door opened slightly, and Zara stood there, her expression guarded. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Elliot said, "and more importantly, a lot of learning. I know I've let you down. I've dismissed your experiences because they made me uncomfortable. That stops now." Zara studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity. "You don't have to do this just because—" "I'm not," Elliot interrupted gently. "I'm doing this because I should have done it from the beginning. I want to understand, really understand what you're going through, and I want to listen, no dismissing, no excuses." They moved to the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch. For the first time, Zara talked without filtering herself. She described how it felt being the only Black student in her classes, the way teachers watched her more closely than other students, the subtle ways classmates excluded her. She talked about Mrs. Harrison's accusations and Claire's compliments that felt like daggers. Elliot listened, really listened, fighting the urge to offer solutions or explanations. When she finished, his eyes were damp. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not just for last night, but for every time I made you feel like your experiences weren't valid. What do you need from me?" Zara seemed surprised by the question. After a moment, she went to her room and returned with a notebook. She'd written down titles of books, documentaries, and websites, resources she'd wished he'd known about. "This is a start," she said, handing him the list. The next day, Elliot called Marcus Chen, one of his few Black colleagues in senior management. "I need advice," he admitted. I'm raising a black daughter, and I'm realizing how unprepared I am. Marcus's response was direct but kind. He connected Elliot with local parent groups and recommended Dr. Angela Turner, a child psychologist who specialized in working with transracial adoptees. Dr. Turner agreed to mentor Zara, meeting with her weekly. She wasn't there to replace Elliot, but to provide Zara with someone who inherently understood her struggles. In their first meeting, Zara talked more than she had in weeks. Elliot also scheduled a meeting with Westbrook Academy's administration. He sat across from Principal Matthews and Mrs. Harrison, his posture calm but determined. "My daughter," he said firmly, emphasizing the word, "wrote that essay entirely on her own. The fact that you questioned her ability based on preconceived notions about her background is exactly the kind of bias we need to address." Mrs. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Grayson, I merely wanted to ensure that the black student couldn't possibly be that intelligent." Elliot's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I've reviewed the school's diversity policies, or rather the lack thereof. That needs to change, and I'm prepared to work with the board to make it happen." The meeting resulted in mandatory sensitivity training for staff and a commitment to revise the school's curriculum to be more inclusive. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Weeks passed. Elliot attended every parent group meeting, read every book on Zara's list, and had long conversations with Dr. Turner about supporting Zara's identity development. He learned to recognize microaggressions before Zara had to point them out, and he never hesitated to address them. One evening, Elliot passed by Zara's room and noticed something different. The duffel bag that had sat packed by her door since day one was missing. He peered in and saw her removing clothes from it, hanging them in her closet alongside the new ones. She caught him watching and paused. "I figured," she said quietly. "Maybe I could stay a while." Elliot's throat tightened with emotion, but he just nodded, understanding the magnitude of this simple act. The bag that had been her escape plan, her security blanket, was finally being emptied. She was choosing to trust him, to believe that this home could truly be hers. The soft glow of the laptop screen illuminated Zara's face as her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. She sat cross-legged on the living room couch, thinking she was alone. The penthouse was quiet except for the gentle hum of the heating system and the distant sounds of traffic below. Elliot paused in the hallway, watching her concentrated expression. He'd noticed how she'd been borrowing his laptop more frequently lately, always closing it quickly when he entered the room. Tonight, he saw what she'd been trying to hide, the familiar blue and white website of St. Mary's Shelter, where he'd first met her. His footsteps made Zara jump. She quickly minimized the window, but not fast enough. Their eyes met, and she saw the recognition in his face. "I was just—" she started, then trailed off, unable to find the right excuse. Elliot sat down beside her, leaving enough space so she wouldn't feel crowded. "You don't have to explain," he said softly, "but I'm here if you want to talk about it." Zara's fingers played with the edge of her sleeve, a nervous habit she'd developed during their first weeks together. "I was checking on some of the kids," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "making sure they're okay." "Do you miss it there?" Elliot asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. "No, maybe, I don't know." Zara's shoulders hunched slightly. "It wasn't great, but at least I knew where I fit in." Elliot considered her words carefully, remembering what he'd learned about displacement and belonging from his recent reading. "Would you like to visit?" he suggested. "We could stop by, see how everyone's doing." Zara looked up, surprise evident on her face. "Really, you wouldn't mind?" "Of course not. We could go tomorrow after school if you'd like." The next afternoon, their car pulled up outside St. Mary's. The brick building looked exactly as it had months ago, but somehow smaller than Zara remembered. She hesitated at the entrance, her hand hovering over the familiar metal handle. Inside, the smell of institutional cleaning products and cafeteria food brought back a rush of memories. Ms. Rodriguez, the shelter manager, greeted them warmly, her eyes crinkling with genuine pleasure at seeing Zara. "Look who's come to visit," she called out, drawing the attention of several children lounging in the common area. Zara felt their stares immediately. Some faces she recognized, Others were new, but all held the same mix of curiosity and something else. Something that made her stomach twist uncomfortably. Marcus, a boy she used to share art supplies with, looked at her designer sneakers and new backpack. "Nice shoes," he said, his tone making it clear it wasn't exactly a compliment. "Thanks," Zara mumbled, suddenly wishing she'd worn her old ones. Jenny, a younger girl who'd arrived just before Zara left, approached cautiously. "Is it true you live in a fancy apartment now? With a pool and everything?" Before Zara could answer, Tommy, one of the older boys, cut in. "Do you even remember what it's like here?" he asked bluntly. "Having to share everything? Getting the same boring food every day?" Zara felt her cheeks burn. Of course she remembered. She remembered everything. The lumpy mattresses, the constant noise, the way new clothes only came when donations arrived. But she also remembered the way they'd all looked out for each other, shared what little they had, celebrated small victories together. "You got lucky," whispered Sarah, a girl Zara used to help with homework. The words weren't mean, but they stung anyway. Elliot watched from a distance, talking with Ms. Rodriguez but keeping an eye on Zara. He saw her discomfort, the way she stood between two worlds, no longer fully part of this one, but still not completely comfortable in her new one. After an hour that felt much longer, Zara made her way back to where Elliot stood. "Can we go?" she asked quietly. In the car, Zara stared out the window, lost in thought. Elliot didn't push her to talk, remembering Dr. Turner's advice about giving her space to process difficult emotions. The silence followed them home and through dinner. Mrs. Connors had made Zara's favorite pasta, but she just pushed it around her plate. It wasn't until later, when Elliot was reviewing foundation documents in his study, that Zara appeared in the doorway. "Can I ask you something?" Her voice was hesitant but determined. Elliot set aside his papers immediately. "Always." "Your foundation, the one that helps the shelter. Could I maybe help with that?" She stepped into the room, fidgeting with her sleeve again. "Not just giving money, but actually doing something?" Elliot felt his heart warm at her request. This was the first time she'd shown interest in his foundation work, the first time she'd actively sought to bridge her past and present lives. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. "What kind of help were you thinking about?" "I know what the kids need," Zara said, her voice growing stronger. "Not just the obvious stuff, but things like art supplies that aren't almost used up, and books that aren't falling apart and—" She paused, gathering courage. "And maybe we could start a program where they get to learn cool stuff like coding or music? Things that make them feel special?" As she spoke, Elliot saw something new in her expression, a spark of purpose, a desire to make meaning out of her experience. She wasn't just accepting her new life, she was finding a way to use it to help others. "Would you like to present these ideas at the next foundation meeting?" he asked. Zara's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Yeah, I think I would." The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting a warm glow across the carefully decorated living room. Colorful balloons bobbed gently in the air conditioning, and a pristine white cake sat centerpiece on the dining table decorated with 12 perfect purple roses, Zara's favorite color. Elliot adjusted the happy birthday banner for the third time, wanting everything to be perfect. He'd spent weeks planning this party, consulting with Mrs. Connors about the menu, and carefully selecting guests from Zara's class, the ones she seemed most comfortable with. "You really don't have to do all this," Zara said from the doorway, fidgeting with the sleeve of her new purple dress. She'd said the same thing when Elliot first mentioned the party, and again when the decorators arrived, and now as she surveyed the transformed living room. "I want to," Elliot replied, stepping back to examine the banner. "Every birthday should be special." Zara shuffled her feet, looking uncomfortable. "At the shelter, we just got cupcakes. All the kids with birthdays that month shared them." Elliot's heart tightened, but he kept his voice light. "Well, this year you get your own cake, and wait until you see what's inside." Mrs. Connors outdid herself. The doorbell chimed, and Zara tensed. Mrs. Connors hurried to answer it, and soon the quiet apartment filled with the sound of excited voices. Emma Carter arrived first, carrying a large gift wrapped in shiny paper. Behind her, other classmates filtered in with their parents all dressed in party clothes and bearing presents. "This is so fancy," Emma said, looking around the apartment with wide eyes. "My mom says you're so lucky, Zara. Living here must be like a fairy tale compared to before." Zara's smile stiffened, but she managed a polite, "Thank you for coming," as she accepted Emma's gift. The party started smoothly enough. The kids played some games Elliot had arranged, and Mrs. Connors served finger sandwiches that disappeared quickly. Zara seemed to relax slightly as the afternoon progressed, even laughing during a particularly competitive round of charades. Then came time for cake. As everyone gathered around the table, Emma's mother commented loudly, "It's so wonderful what you've done for her, Mr. Grayson. Such a charitable act." Before Elliot could respond, Tommy Parker, one of the boys from Zara's class, piped up, "Hey, Zara, do you know who your real parents are? Like, your actual mom and dad?" The room went quiet. Zara's hands clenched at her sides, her face flushing dark with anger and embarrassment. "My mother is real," she snapped, her voice sharp. "And she loved me. Don't talk about things you don't understand." "Zara," Mrs. Parker gasped. "That's no way to speak to Tommy. He was just asking a question." "Mr. Grayson," Emma's mother said with a disapproving frown, "perhaps we should discuss Zara's attitude problem. This kind of behavior—" "There is no attitude problem," Elliot cut in firmly, his voice carrying across the room. "Zara responded to an inappropriate and insensitive question. If anything, we should be discussing why our children think it's acceptable to make such personal inquiries." But when he turned to support Zara directly, she was already gone. The sound of feet on the stairs told him where she'd fled. "Perhaps we should call it a day," Elliot said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Mrs. Connors began helping the startled parents gather their children's things, while Elliot tried to maintain a polite facade through the awkward goodbyes. Once the last guest had left, Elliot climbed the stairs to Zara's room. He knocked softly on her door. "Go away," came the muffled response. "Can we talk?" Elliot asked. "Just us?" After a long pause, he heard movement, and the door opened slightly. Zara's eyes were red, but her face was set in a determined expression he'd come to recognize. "I want to know about my mother," she said before he could speak. "My real mother. Not what the social workers told you, but everything. The truth." Elliot had known this moment would come, but he'd hoped to wait until she was older, better prepared for the harsh realities. Looking at her now, though, he saw not just a hurt 12-year-old, but a young woman beginning to piece together her identity. "Okay," he said, pushing the door open wider. "Let's sit down." They settled on her window seat, the city lights twinkling below them. Zara pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small, but keeping her eyes fixed on Elliot. "Your mother's name was Marie Toussaint," Elliot began carefully. "She was convicted of a crime when you were very young. The details in her case, there are things that don't add up." "What kind of things?" Zara's voice was barely a whisper. "Missing evidence, witnesses who changed their stories, a public defender who was handling too many cases to give hers proper attention." Elliot paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I've been thinking about looking into it more thoroughly, but I wanted to wait until you were ready." Zara uncurled slightly, her expression intense. "I'm ready now. I want to know everything." Elliot nodded slowly. "There's someone I know, a private investigator who specializes in cases like your mother's. Would you want me to ask her to look into it?" "Yes," Zara said immediately, then hesitated. "But what if we find out something bad?" "Then we'll face it together," Elliot assured her. "But whatever we discover, it won't change who you are, or that you're my daughter." Zara was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Finally, she asked, "When can we start?" "I'll make the call tomorrow," Elliot promised. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "But first, you still have one more birthday present to open." Zara took the box carefully, Inside was a delicate gold locket. When she opened it, she found a tiny photo of herself and Elliot from their first Christmas together. "The other side is empty," Elliot explained softly. "I thought, when we find a photo of your mother, it could go there, so you can keep both parts of your family close to your heart." Zara's fingers closed around the locket, and for the first time that day, her smile was real. Without warning, she launched herself into Elliot's arms, hugging him tightly. That night, after Zara had gone to bed, Elliot sat in his study and pulled out a business card he'd been holding onto for months. "Sarah, private investigator," it read in simple black text. He picked up his phone and began to dial. Sarah's voice crackled through Elliot's phone speaker, her tone carefully measured. "Mr. Grayson, I found something significant about Zara's family history. Are you sitting down?" Elliot settled deeper into his leather office chair, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany desk. "I'm ready. What did you find?" "I've traced Zara's maternal lineage. Her grandfather is Charles Toussaint." The drumming stopped. Elliot's hand froze mid-tap as the name hit him like a physical force. "Charles Toussaint? Are you certain?" "Absolutely. I've verified it through multiple sources. Marie Toussaint was his only daughter." Elliot's mind raced back 15 years to a different office, a different time. He saw Charles Toussaint standing at a whiteboard, explaining market projections with the commanding presence that had earned him the nickname the Tech Prophet in Silicon Valley circles. Charles had been more than just another executive. He'd been a pioneer, one of the first black entrepreneurs to break into the upper echelons of the tech world, and he'd been Elliot's mentor. "Mr. Grayson, are you still there?" "Yes, sorry." Elliot shook himself back to the present. "It's just, I knew Charles. He helped launch my career." "That's quite a coincidence," Sarah said. "Though given the circles you move in, perhaps not entirely surprising. There's more you should know. I've been digging into what happened to him after he left the industry." Elliot opened his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "I lost track of him years ago. He just vanished." "That's the thing. It wasn't just a disappearance, it was more like an erasure." Elliot's search results confirmed her words. Where there should have been pages of articles about Charles's innovations and business successes, there were only scattered references, most of them brief mentions in older industry newsletters. His company, Tech Vision Solutions, barely appeared in any current databases. "How is this possible?" Elliot muttered, more to himself than Sarah. Tech Vision was revolutionary. Their patents alone should have... "The patents were systematically challenged and overturned," Sarah explained. "The company's achievements were gradually attributed to competitors. It's like someone deliberately wrote him out of tech history." Elliot remembered the last time he'd seen Charles at a tech conference in 2008. The older man had seemed distracted, worried about something he wouldn't discuss. A month later, he'd resigned from Tech Vision's board and disappeared from public life. "There were rumors," Sarah continued, "about pressure from larger companies, about racial discrimination disguised as technical disputes, but nothing concrete. Everyone involved either won't talk or has signed ironclad NDAs." Elliot opened another tab, searching for news from that period. He found vague mentions of technical disputes and patent challenges, but the real story seemed buried under layers of corporate speak and careful omissions. "I reached out to Marcus Webb," Sarah added. "He was on Tech Vision's board with Charles." "What did he say?" "He wouldn't talk on record, but his exact words were, 'You don't want to dig into this, Elliot.'" Then he hung up. Elliot leaned back in his chair, memories flooding back. He remembered Charles's passion for innovation, his belief that technology could level playing fields and create opportunities for everyone. He'd been more than just successful. He'd been inspiring, showing a generation of entrepreneurs that barriers could be broken, and someone had systematically erased that legacy. "Have you found any current information on Charles?" Elliot asked. "Where he is now?" "He's alive," Sarah confirmed. "I've traced some property records and financial transactions. He's living quietly, off the grid, but not completely hidden. Would you like the address?" Elliot glanced at the framed photo on his desk. Zara at her birthday party wearing the locket he'd given her. One side still empty, waiting for a connection to her past. "Yes," he said firmly. "Send me everything you have." After hanging up, Elliot sat in his quiet office, processing the implications of what he'd learned. Zara wasn't just connected to Charles Toussaint. She was his granddaughter. The man who had helped shape Elliot's career, who had shown him what true innovation looked like, was family to the girl he'd adopted. He pulled up old photos from his early days in tech. There was Charles at a product launch, commanding the stage with his signature confidence. Another showed them together at a charity gala, Charles's hand on young Elliot's shoulder as they discussed market strategies with potential investors. The contrast between those images and Charles's current obscurity felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Elliot thought about Zara facing similar barriers at her school, dealing with the same prejudices wrapped in different packages. How much had really changed? He reached for his phone again, scrolling through contacts until he found another old colleague who had worked with Charles. The call went straight to voicemail. "Jack, it's Elliot Grayson. I'm looking into what happened with Charles Toussaint and Tech Vision. I know it was a long time ago, but if you have any information, this is important. More important than you know?" He tried 2 more contacts. One didn't answer. The other picked up but quickly made an excuse to end the call when Charles's name came up. The pattern was clear. People were still afraid to talk about what had happened, which meant there was something to hide. Elliot opened the email from Sarah, studying the address she'd found for Charles. It was in a small town 3 hours away, far from the tech corridors and business centers where he'd once been a commanding presence. Looking at Zara's photo again, Elliot made his decision. Charles Toussaint had once helped him find his path in life. Now it was time to return the favor, not just for Charles, but for Zara. She deserved to know her history, to understand the legacy that had been hidden from her. He needed to find Charles Toussaint, not just for answers about the past, but for Zara's future. She deserved to know the truth about her family, about the grandfather who had shaped an industry before being forced into shadows. The small house sat at the end of a quiet street, its weathered blue paint and modest appearance a stark contrast to the mansion where Charles Toussaint had once lived. Elliot parked his car along the curb, double-checking the address on his phone. The November wind rustled through bare trees, sending dead leaves skittering across the cracked concrete driveway. For a moment, Elliot stayed in his car studying the house. The front yard was neat but simple, no elaborate landscaping, just a well-maintained lawn and a few hardy shrubs. A worn pickup truck sat in the driveway, its faded paint matching the humble surroundings. It was hard to believe this was where one of tech's most brilliant minds had chosen to disappear. Taking a deep breath, Elliot stepped out of his car. Each footstep up the concrete path felt heavier than the last. He'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times on the drive over, but now all his carefully planned words seemed inadequate. The doorbell was old, its brass finish dulled with age. Elliot pressed it, hearing a muffled chime inside. His heart pounded as footsteps approached from within. The door opened, revealing a man Elliot barely recognized. Charles Toussaint had aged considerably in the years since they'd last met. His once commanding presence was diminished, his shoulders slightly stooped. The designer suits were replaced by worn jeans and a plain sweater. But his eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, were the same, even if they showed no spark of recognition as they studied Elliot's face. "Can I help you?" Charles's voice was gruff, guarded. "Mr. Toussaint," Elliot said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Elliot Grayson. We worked together years ago at—" "I know who you are." Charles's expression hardened. "What I don't know is why you're here." The cold reception stung, but Elliot pressed on. "May I come in? There's something important we need to discuss." Charles hesitated, his hand tightening on the doorframe. For a moment, Elliot thought he might shut the door. But finally, he stepped back, gesturing stiffly for Elliot to enter. The interior of the house was like its owner, modest but dignified. Basic furniture, clean lines, nothing fancy. A stack of engineering books sat on a side table, their pages marked with sticky notes. Even in retirement, Charles hadn't lost his passion for learning. "Make it quick," Charles said, remaining standing as Elliot took a seat on a worn armchair. "I left that world behind for a reason." Elliot leaned forward, choosing his next words carefully. "It's about your granddaughter, Zara." The change in Charles was instant and dramatic. His whole body tensed, and something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or fear. "Get out. Please just listen. That part of my life is gone." Charles's voice was sharp, but there was a tremor beneath the anger. "I don't know how you found out about her, but it's none of your business." "I adopted her." The words hung in the air between them. Charles sank slowly into the chair opposite Elliot, his face ashen. "What did you say?" "I adopted Zara 6 months ago. She was living in a shelter after—" Elliot paused, watching Charles's reaction. "After her mother was imprisoned." Charles turned away, staring out the window at his bare yard. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Marie, my daughter." "What happened?" Elliot asked gently. "Why weren't you there for them?" The question seemed to age Charles another decade. He rubbed his face with weathered hands before answering. "Marie was brilliant, just like her mother, but she was also headstrong, rebellious. When she started dating James," he shook his head. "I saw trouble coming. He was charismatic, sure, but reckless. No steady job, always chasing get-rich-quick schemes." "Zara's father?" Charles nodded. "I tried to warn her. We fought about it constantly. The more I pushed, the more she pulled away. When she got pregnant..." He trailed off, lost in painful memories. "I said things I shouldn't have, made threats about cutting her off financially. I thought I could control the situation, just like I controlled everything else in my life." "What happened to James?" "Disappeared before Zara was born, just like I predicted." Bitterness crept into Charles's voice. "But by then, Marie wouldn't accept my help. Said she'd rather struggle than let me control her life. Then came the arrest." Elliot leaned forward. "She was wrongfully convicted." "Of course she was." Charles's voice cracked with sudden emotion. "I tried to help then. Hired the best lawyers, called in favors. But Marie, she wouldn't even see me. Said I only wanted to help to prove I was right all along." He laughed, a hollow sound. Maybe she was right about that too. The silence that followed was heavy with regret. Elliot reached for his phone, pulling up a recent photo of Zara. She was sitting in their library, absorbed in a book, her face serious and focused. Without a word, he held the phone out to Charles. Charles stared at the screen for a long moment. His hard exterior cracked, revealing the pain beneath. His hand trembled slightly as he touched the screen. "She looks like her mother, doesn't she?" The words were soft, filled with a mixture of wonder and grief. In that moment, Charles wasn't the legendary entrepreneur or the bitter recluse. He was simply a grandfather, seeing his granddaughter for the first time. "She's brilliant," Elliot said quietly. "Top of her class, passionate about justice, stubborn as hell when she believes in something." A ghost of a smile touched Charles's lips. "Like her mother." "She deserves to know her history, Charles. The good and the bad. She deserves to know where she comes from." Charles handed the phone back, his movements careful and deliberate. He stood and walked to the window, his back to Elliot. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his face as he stared out at nothing in particular. The weight of the past hung heavy in the room. Elliot waited, watching Charles wrestle with demons he'd kept locked away for years. The choice before him was clear, but far from easy. Stay hidden in his self-imposed exile, or take a chance on reconnecting with the family he'd lost. Charles Toussaint stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the fading afternoon light. His shoulders were hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. After what felt like an eternity, he turned back to face Elliot, his expression a mask of resignation. "She's better off without me," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung heavy in the modest living room, echoing with years of regret. Elliot leaned forward in his chair, shaking his head. That's not true, and you know it. Zara deserves to know her history, to understand where she comes from. History? Charles let out a bitter laugh. You mean she deserves to know how her grandfather abandoned her mother when she needed him most? How I was too proud, too controlling to see what really mattered? He picked up one of the engineering books from the side table, running his fingers over its worn cover. I failed Marie. Failed her so completely that she wouldn't even let me help when everything fell apart. But you tried, Elliot pressed. You hired lawyers, I tried too late. Charles's voice cracked with emotion. Don't you understand? I only stepped in when I thought I could prove I was right all along. Marie saw right through that. He set the book down with trembling hands. She knew me better than I knew myself. Elliot stood up, crossing the room to stand near Charles. Listen to me. Zara is 12 years old and she's brilliant. She asks questions about her family, about where she comes from. She deserves answers. Answers? Charles turned to face him fully. Like how her grandfather was once somebody important until he let racism and pride destroy everything he built? How I couldn't protect my own daughter from an unjust system because I was too busy trying to control her life instead of supporting her? Yes, Elliot said firmly. All of it. The successes and the failures. She's strong enough to handle the truth. Charles sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every bit his age. She'll hate me. You don't know that. I do. Charles stared at his hands, weathered and lined with age. Because if I were her, I'd hate me too. Elliot tried a different approach. What happened in the business world, Charles? Why did you really disappear? The change in Charles was immediate and stark. His expression hardened, and his posture became rigid. That's not relevant. It is if it affected your family, if it's part of why you weren't there for Marie. I said it's not relevant. Charles's tone was ice cold, the same commanding voice that had once dominated boardrooms. Some doors are better left closed, Mr. Grayson. But no. Charles stood abruptly. I think it's time for you to leave. Elliot knew that look. It was the same expression Zara got when she'd made up her mind about something. That same stubborn determination that could be both a strength and a weakness. He realized he wouldn't get through to Charles today, not when the wounds were still so fresh from being reopened. All right, Elliot said quietly, reaching for his coat. I'll go. But this isn't over, Charles. Zara deserves to know her grandfather, and you deserve a chance to know her. Charles didn't respond, just walked stiffly to the front door and opened it. The late afternoon air rushed in, cold and sharp. Thank you for your time, Elliot said, pausing in the doorway. I'll be in touch. Charles's only response was to close the door firmly behind him. The drive home was a blur of thoughts and questions. Elliot's mind kept circling back to the way Charles had shut down at the mention of his business career. There was more there, something painful enough to make a proud man choose complete isolation over facing it. By the time Elliot pulled into his building's parking garage, night had fallen. The penthouse was quiet when he entered, save for the soft sound of music coming from Zara's room. He could picture her there, probably reading or working on homework, unaware that her entire family history had just been uncovered. In his office, Elliot poured himself a small glass of scotch and sat heavily in his chair. The photo of Zara that he'd shown Charles was still open on his phone. He studied it now, seeing the echoes of Charles in her serious expression, in the way she held herself with such quiet dignity even at 12. Should he tell her? The question weighed on him as he sipped his drink. On one hand, she had a right to know about Charles, about her mother's story. But if Charles refused to meet her, would knowing just cause her more pain? She'd already dealt with so much abandonment in her young life. Voices from their recent past echoed in his mind. Social workers questioning if he could understand the unique challenges of raising a black child, warning him about the importance of cultural connection and identity. They'd been right about so many things. Was he now failing Zara by keeping this information from her? But then he remembered the look in Charles's eyes when he saw her photo. There had been love there, buried under layers of guilt and regret. Maybe, with time, that love would be strong enough to break through the walls Charles had built around himself. Elliot set his glass down, decision made. He would wait, not forever, but long enough to try reaching Charles again. Zara deserved more than just another story of abandonment. She deserved a chance at a real relationship with her grandfather, if only Charles could find the courage to try. The music from Zara's room changed to something softer, more contemplative. Elliot closed the photo on his phone, tucking away the secret of Charles Toussaint for just a little longer. The autumn sun streamed through the tall windows of Westbrook Academy, casting long shadows across polished floors. Zara sat in her usual spot, third row, far right, trying to make herself as small as possible. It wasn't that she was afraid. She was just tired. Tired of being the only black student in most of her classes. Tired of the sideways glances and whispered comments. Tired of having to explain herself constantly. Mrs. Peterson stood at the front of the classroom, her voice animated as she discussed the great business innovators of the 20th century. Names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford filled the air. With each new example, each celebration of another white man's success, Zara felt herself shrinking further into her chair. "These visionaries shaped our modern world," Mrs. Peterson declared, writing another name on the whiteboard. "They built empires from nothing, showing us what true American innovation looks like." Zara's hand shot up before she could stop herself. The familiar weight of being the one to speak up settled in her stomach, but she pushed through it. "Yes, Zara?" Mrs. Peterson's smile was polite but distant. "Why haven't we discussed any black entrepreneurs?" Zara's voice came out stronger than she expected. There must have been successful black business leaders, too. The classroom fell silent. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Emma, 2 rows over, rolled her eyes dramatically. Mrs. Peterson's smile tightened. "Well, there just aren't as many examples from that time period. We're focusing on the most influential figures." "But," Zara started, "perhaps we can discuss diversity in business during Black History Month." Mrs. Peterson cut her off smoothly. Now, returning to Henry Ford's assembly line innovations, Zara's cheeks burned. She wanted to argue to point out how wrong it was to relegate black achievement to a single month, but she bit her tongue. She'd learned that pushing too hard only made things worse. That afternoon, instead of heading straight to her room to do homework, Zara made her way to Elliot's home office. He was still at work, but his extensive collection of business books lined the walls. She began pulling them down, one after another, searching for faces that looked like hers. Hours passed. The sky outside darkened and her eyes grew tired from reading, but she kept going, driven by a determination she couldn't quite explain. She moved from books to the internet, typing searches into Elliot's computer. Black business leaders 1900s, African American entrepreneurs history, Black tech pioneers. Page after page of results scrolled by. Some names she recognized from her own research, Madam C.J. Walker, Annie Malone. But then something caught her eye. A headline from 20 years ago. Tech visionary Charles Toussaint steps down, industry giant's sudden departure raises questions. Zara clicked the link. The article loaded, revealing a photo of a distinguished black man in his 50s. He stood tall and proud in an expensive suit, his expression serious but with kindness in his eyes. Something about his face made Zara's heart skip a beat. The shape of his jaw, the way he held himself. It felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. She read frantically, absorbing every detail. Charles Toussaint had been a pioneer in early computer networking. His company had developed groundbreaking technology. But then, suddenly, he'd disappeared from the industry. The article hinted at controversies, at pressure from competitors, at racial tensions, but provided no clear answers. Zara's hands shook as she searched for more recent information. There was almost nothing after his departure, just vague references to his innovations being absorbed by larger companies. It was as if someone had tried to erase him from history, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she knew his face. She opened another tab, pulling up the few photos she had of her mother. Her breath caught in her throat. There, in her mother's high school graduation photo, she saw it. The same proud jaw, the same dignified bearing. The sound of the front door opening barely registered. Footsteps approached the office, and Elliot's voice called out, "Zara, are you in here?" She spun around in the chair just as he appeared in the doorway. His expression changed instantly when he saw what was on the screen. "Who is he?" Zara demanded, her voice trembling. "Why does he look like my mom?" Elliot's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, concern, resignation. He moved slowly into the office, setting his briefcase down with deliberate care. "Zara," he began, "tell me the truth." Her words came out sharp and clear. "I'm tired of not knowing who I am or where I come from. Who is Charles Toussaint?" Elliot sank into one of the leather chairs facing the desk. He looked suddenly tired, as if carrying a heavy weight. "I was going to tell you," he said softly. "I was just waiting for the right time." "Tell me what?" But Zara already knew. Deep down, she'd known from the moment she saw that photograph. Elliot met her eyes directly, his expression gentle but serious. "Charles Toussaint is your grandfather, Zara." The words hit her like a physical force. She gripped the arms of the chair, anchoring herself as the room seemed to spin. A grandfather. She had a grandfather. And not just any grandfather. A brilliant man, an innovator, someone who had achieved incredible things. Why? She had to stop, swallow hard, start again. Why didn't anyone tell me? The silence in Elliot's office felt heavy enough to touch. Zara sat frozen in the leather chair, her fingers still gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The computer screen behind her still showed Charles Toussaint's face, his eyes seeming to watch the scene unfold. "I don't understand," Zara finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew about him?" Elliot leaned forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees. The usual confidence in his posture was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. "I found out a few weeks ago," he admitted. "The private investigator I hired discovered the connection." "Weeks?" The word came out sharp, cutting through the air between them. "You've known for weeks?" "Yes," Elliot said softly. "I wanted to be sure before I told you. I needed to understand the whole story." Zara's mind raced, putting pieces together. The late nights Elliot had been working, the mysterious phone calls, the way he'd been extra attentive lately, as if trying to make up for something. "You met him, didn't you?" Elliot's silence was answer enough. "You met him!" Zara pushed herself up from the chair, her whole body trembling. "You went to see my grandfather without telling me? How could you?" "Zara, please try to understand." "Understand what?" Her voice cracked. "That you kept this huge secret from me? That you went behind my back to meet someone from my family? My real family?" "I am your real family too," Elliot said quietly, but Zara was too upset to hear the hurt in his voice. "Then why didn't you tell me?" She paced the office, her movements sharp and agitated. "Did you think I couldn't handle it? That I'm too young? Too fragile?" "No, of course not." Elliot stood up slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might spook her. "I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" Zara spun to face him. "From what? From knowing who I am? From having a chance to meet my own grandfather?" "It's complicated, Zara. Charles, he's been through a lot. He lost everything, his company, his reputation. When your mother went to prison, he—" "Oh, so now you're defending him?" Zara's eyes flashed with anger. "He abandoned my mom when she needed him most. He let her go to prison. He never even tried to find me." "That's not entirely true," Elliot tried to explain. "He did try to help your mother, but by then their relationship was already broken. He made mistakes, yes, but he's carried that guilt ever since." "Guilt?" Zara let out a bitter laugh. "Is that supposed to make it better? He feels guilty about leaving his daughter to rot in prison while I bounced around foster homes?" He was dealing with his own struggles. The business world had turned against him. He was fighting battles on every front. Stop making excuses for him. Zara's voice rose, filling the office. He had a choice. He could have been there for us, but he chose to walk away, just like everyone else in my life. The moment the words left her mouth, she saw Elliot flinch. She knew she'd hurt him, knew she was being unfair. He hadn't walked away. He'd chosen her, fought for her, given her a home. But right now, the pain and betrayal were too raw. "And now what?" she demanded. "You think I should just meet him? Pretend everything's okay? Act like he didn't destroy my mom's life?" "No one's asking you to pretend anything," Elliot said gently. "Charles knows he doesn't deserve forgiveness. He told me himself that you're better off without him." "At least he got that right," Zara muttered. But something in her chest tightened at the words. Better off without him. Just like she'd been better off without her mother, according to the social workers. Better off without her past, according to her teachers. Better off forgetting who she really was. "He's not a bad man, Zara," Elliot continued. "He made terrible mistakes, yes, but he was also brilliant, innovative. He changed the tech industry before they pushed him out. That's part of your heritage, too." "My heritage?" Zara's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You mean the heritage that got erased? The one nobody at school even knows about? The one he gave up on?" "I know you're angry. You don't know anything." The words exploded out of her. "You don't know what it's like to have pieces of yourself missing, to wonder where you came from, to find out that someone who should have loved you just didn't care enough to try." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't bother wiping them away. All the hurt, all the confusion, all the years of wondering why nobody wanted her. It all came crashing down at once. "And you." She jabbed a finger at Elliot. "You kept this from me. You went to see him. You decided what I should or shouldn't know about my own family." "I was going to tell you," Elliot said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just wanted to make sure." "Make sure of what? That I could handle it? That he was worth meeting? That's not your decision to make." Before Elliot could respond, Zara turned and stormed out of the office. Her feet pounded against the hardwood floors as she ran down the hallway to her room. The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the pictures on the walls. In his office, Elliot stood alone, the sound of the slam still echoing in his ears. He sank back into his chair, head in his hands. For the first time since bringing Zara home, he felt completely lost. He'd tried so hard to protect her, to do what he thought was right, but now he worried he'd done exactly the opposite. The trust between them, so carefully built over months of patience and understanding, felt suddenly fragile. He'd seen it in her eyes, in the way she'd looked at him like he was just another adult who'd let her down. The realization hit him hard. In trying to shield her from pain, he might have just caused exactly what he'd been trying to prevent. The next few days in the Grayson household felt like walking on eggshells. Zara moved through her daily routine with mechanical precision, speaking only when necessary and keeping her responses clipped and short. Every morning she was up and ready for school before Elliot could even attempt their usual breakfast conversation. Every afternoon she disappeared into her room or the building's gym, throwing herself into homework and track practice with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Elliot watched helplessly as she built walls around herself brick by brick. When he tried to bring up Charles during dinner, Zara would simply push her plate away and excuse herself. If he mentioned the tech industry's history, hoping to spark a discussion about her grandfather's legacy, she would put on her headphones and pretend not to hear. Mrs. Connors, the housekeeper, noticed the tension too. She found Zara spending more time in the building's indoor track, running lap after lap until her legs shook with exhaustion. Sometimes, she'd peek through the gym's window and see the young girl sitting alone on the track, staring into space with red-rimmed eyes. "She's processing," Mrs. Connors told Elliot one morning, as they watched Zara rush out the door for early track practice. "Give her time." But time seemed to make things worse. At school, Zara threw herself into every activity possible. She joined the debate team, signed up for extra credit projects, and stayed late for track practice. Her teachers sent glowing emails about her sudden burst of academic enthusiasm, but Elliot saw through it. She wasn't driven by passion, she was running away from her feelings. One evening, as Elliot sat in his office reviewing documents, his phone buzzed. The number wasn't saved, but he recognized it immediately. Charles. "I've been thinking." Charles's voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it in days. "About Zara. About everything." Elliot set down his pen, giving the conversation his full attention. "What's on your mind?" "I made a mistake," Charles admitted. "When you came to see me, I was a coward. I've been a coward for too long." Through the phone, Elliot heard the sound of paper rustling. "I wrote her a letter," Charles continued. "It's not much, but it's a start. I tried to explain about her mother, about what happened to the company, about why I—" His voice cracked slightly. "Why I wasn't there." "A letter?" Elliot leaned forward in his chair. "Are you sure?" "No," Charles let out a bitter laugh. "I'm not sure about anything anymore, but she deserves to know the truth. All of it. Even the parts that make me look like the failure I am." The next morning, a cream-colored envelope arrived by courier. Elliot recognized Charles's elegant handwriting. Some habits from his executive days clearly hadn't faded. The letter was addressed simply, "To Zara." Elliot waited until Zara was at school before entering her room. He placed the letter carefully on her desk, propping it against her laptop where she couldn't miss it. Then he left, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this would be the bridge they needed. But days passed and the letter remained untouched. Elliot watched as Zara skillfully maneuvered around it, doing her homework on her bed instead of her desk, pretending the envelope didn't exist. When Mrs. Connors tried to dust around it, Zara snapped at her not to touch anything on the desk. The letter sat there like a ghost, haunting the room with its presence. Sometimes, late at night, Elliot would pass by Zara's room and see her staring at it from her bed, her expression unreadable in the darkness. But she never reached for it, never showed any sign of wanting to know its contents. A week after the letter arrived, Elliot returned home early from a business meeting. The penthouse was quiet. Zara was still at track practice, and Mrs. Connors had left for the day. He walked past Zara's open door and stopped short. The letter was gone. His heart sank as he approached her desk, hoping maybe she'd finally read it. But a quick glance around the room revealed the truth. There, in the small wastebasket beside her desk, lay the cream-colored envelope, still sealed, still unread. Elliot picked up the letter, feeling its weight in his hands. All of Charles's explanations, his regrets, his hopes for some kind of connection, all of it discarded without even a glance. He sighed deeply, realizing that the bridge between past and present wouldn't be built so easily. The sound of the front door opening made him quickly return the letter to the trash. He stepped out of Zara's room just as she walked past, her track bag slung over her shoulder, her face flushed from practice. "Good run?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Zara nodded without looking at him. "Beat my personal record." "That's great," Elliot said, but she was already heading to her room. He watched as she closed the door, shutting him out once again. Standing in the hallway, Elliot felt the weight of everything unsaid between them. He thought about the letter in the trash, about Charles sitting alone in his modest house, probably waiting for a response that would never come. He thought about Zara, running faster and faster on the track as if she could somehow outrun her own history. This wasn't something that could be fixed with time alone, he realized. The wounds were too deep, the hurt too raw. Charles's letter might have been a step in the right direction, but it was clear now that Zara wasn't ready to take that step. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. Elliot walked back to his office, each step heavy with the understanding that some bridges take longer to build than others. The distance between Zara and her past, between her and Charles, couldn't be crossed with just one letter, no matter how heartfelt. It would take more time, more patience, more understanding than any of them had initially thought. The autumn days grew shorter, and the mood in the Grayson penthouse grew heavier with each passing week. Zara maintained a rigorous schedule that left little room for conversation or connection. Every morning she was up before dawn, reviewing her homework one last time before heading to early track practice. Her afternoons were filled with debate team meetings, study groups, and additional training sessions. By evening, she retreated to her room, citing mountains of assignments as her excuse for skipping family dinner. Elliot watched this carefully orchestrated dance of avoidance with growing concern. The bright, challenging conversations they once shared over breakfast had dwindled to mumbled good mornings and the scraping of chairs against the floor. Even Mrs. Connors noticed the change, commenting that Zara's usually neat room had become cluttered with energy drink cans and half-finished protein bars, signs of someone trying too hard to keep moving. At school, Zara's teachers praised her dedication, but there was an edge to their comments. "She's always the first to raise her hand," her English teacher wrote in an email to Elliot, "but sometimes I wonder if she's pushing herself too hard." Her history teacher noted that while her essays were impeccable, she seemed to zone out during class discussions, especially when topics touched on family or heritage. The breaking point came during a crucial track meet. Zara had been undefeated in the 400-meter dash all season, her times consistently improving. But that Wednesday afternoon, something was different. From the stands, Elliot could see it in her stance at the starting line, her usual focused energy replaced by a tight, anxious tension. The gun went off and Zara burst forward, but her rhythm was off. Her usually smooth stride looked forced, mechanical. By the final turn, where she typically pulled ahead of the pack, she was struggling. She finished third, her first loss of the season. Afterward, her coach approached Elliot, concern evident in her expression. "She's been pushing herself too hard in practice," Coach Martinez said, watching as Zara sat alone on the bleachers, staring at nothing. "Yesterday she asked to stay late, ran until she nearly collapsed. This isn't like her." That same evening, Zara's AP chemistry teacher emailed Elliot about a pop quiz she'd failed, her first grade below an A since starting at the academy. The teacher mentioned finding Zara asleep during study period, something that had never happened before. At home, the silence between them grew thicker. Zara spent hours in her room with the door closed, the sound of her typing a constant reminder of her self-imposed isolation. When Elliot knocked to check on her, she'd quickly say she was fine, that she just needed to finish one more assignment, review one more chapter. Finally, after watching her pick at her dinner for the third night in a row, Elliot decided he couldn't stay quiet any longer. He waited until she started to rise from the table, her plate barely touched. "Why won't you even consider reading his letter?" he asked softly. Zara froze halfway out of her chair. The kitchen light cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes that she'd been trying to hide. "Don't," she warned, her voice tight. But Elliot pressed on, gentle but firm. "You're hurting yourself, Zara. I can see it. Your teachers can see it. Coach Martinez can see it." "I'm fine," she snapped, but her hands gripped the back of her chair so hard her knuckles turned white. "You're not fine. You're running yourself into the ground trying to avoid dealing with this." Zara's composure cracked. She spun to face him, eyes blazing with a mix of anger and pain. "He erased my mom," she burst out, her voice raw with emotion. "He doesn't get to come back just because he feels guilty now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken hurt. Zara's chest heaved as if she'd just finished another race, but this time there was no finish line in sight. "When my mom needed him most, he wasn't there," she continued, softer now but with no less intensity. "He let them take her away. He let them erase her from his perfect life. And now what? He writes one letter and everything's supposed to be okay?" Elliot watched as she fought back tears, her walls finally crumbling after weeks of holding everything in. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he knew she needed this moment to let it all out. "You don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "Everyone keeps telling me I should be grateful he wants to know me now. But where was he when I was sleeping in shelters? Where was he when I had to change schools every few months? Where was he when—" her voice broke, "when I needed someone to tell me my mom wasn't a bad person?" The silence that followed was deafening. Zara stood there, trembling slightly, looking more vulnerable than Elliot had seen her since those first days at the shelter. Without another word, she turned and walked to her room, closing the door quietly behind her, somehow more final than any slam could have been. Elliot remained at the kitchen table, her words echoing in his mind. He thought about Charles, about the letter in the trash, about all the complicated threads of pain and loss that connected them all. Pushing harder wouldn't help. It would only make Zara retreat further into herself. Later that night, after the penthouse had grown quiet, Elliot sat in his office and began to make notes. If Zara wasn't ready to hear Charles's story directly, perhaps there were other ways to help her understand her heritage. He started researching organizations that preserved Black business history, particularly focusing on the tech industry's often overlooked pioneers. He made careful plans, quiet arrangements that wouldn't pressure Zara, but would be there when she was ready. A documentary series about Black entrepreneurs was added to their streaming queue. Books about resilient women in business appeared casually on the living room shelves. He reached out to successful Black women in tech, laying groundwork for potential mentorship opportunities, all without mentioning Charles or the letter. The evening settled over the city like a heavy blanket, the autumn sun casting long shadows through the penthouse windows. Zara padded quietly down the hallway in her sock feet, heading to the kitchen for a late-night snack. Her stomach had been growling during her study session, probably because she'd barely touched her dinner again. The soft glow from Elliot's office caught her attention as she passed. The door was slightly ajar, and his voice drifted out in that serious tone he used for business calls. She was about to continue on her way when a name stopped her dead in her tracks. "Charles, you can't give up now." Zara's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart hammering so loud she worried Elliot might hear it. "I know the letter was returned unopened," Elliot continued, his voice heavy with concern. "But you have to understand what she's going through." There was a pause, and Zara could barely make out the muffled voice on the other end of the line. She inched closer to the door, straining to hear. "She's just a child," Charles's voice came through faintly, sounding tired and defeated. "Maybe this was a mistake. I've caused enough damage." "That's exactly why she needs you now," Elliot insisted. "She's struggling with who she is, where she comes from. Every day at school she faces questions about her identity, her background. She needs to know her history." Another pause, longer this time. Zara found herself holding her breath, waiting for Charles's response. "And what if knowing that history only hurts her more?" Charles asked. "What if learning about my failures, about how I let her mother down, makes everything worse?" Zara's fingers curled against the wall, her nails digging into the expensive wallpaper. She could hear the pain in Charles's voice, so raw and familiar it made her chest ache. "She's scared, Charles," Elliot said softly. "Scared that if she lets you in, she'll be betraying her mother." The words hit Zara like a physical blow. How did Elliot know? She hadn't even admitted that fear to herself, but hearing it spoken aloud made her realize how true it was. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on so long that Zara wondered if the call had dropped. Then Charles's voice came back, barely above a whisper. "I understand that. I made that mistake once, pushing my daughter away. I don't want to make it again." Zara's legs felt weak. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, Charles's words echoing in her head. The parallel wasn't lost on her. Her mother had pushed Charles away, refusing his help when she needed it most. And now here she was doing the exact same thing. "Your daughter," Elliot said carefully. "She made her choices based on hurt and anger. Are you going to let Zara do the same thing?" "No," Charles replied, his voice stronger now. "But I won't force myself into her life either. She needs to want this, Elliot. She needs to be ready. And if she's never ready, then that's her choice to make. I lost that right years ago when I let my pride get in the way of being there for my daughter." Zara pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. She could hear the regret in Charles's voice, the weight of years of guilt and pain. It reminded her of how her mother used to sound sometimes late at night in the shelters when she thought Zara was asleep. Charles continued, "Just tell me how she's doing. Is she happy? Is she safe?" "She's brilliant," Elliot said, and Zara could hear the pride in his voice. "Top of her class, star athlete. But she's carrying so much, Charles. She works herself to exhaustion trying to prove something. To herself, to the world. I don't know." "Like her mother," Charles said softly. "Always trying to prove she deserved her place in the world." Zara pressed her face against her knees, fighting back tears. She'd never thought about it that way before. How her drive to excel might be connected to something deeper, something inherited. "I should go," Charles said. "Thank you, Elliot, for everything you're doing for her, for being the father I failed to be." "You're not a failure, Charles, you're human, and it's not too late to make things right." The conversation wound down, but Zara wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was racing, replaying Charles's words over and over, the way he spoke about her mother, not with judgment or disappointment, but with understanding and regret, the way he seemed to know her even though they'd never met. She pushed herself up from the floor, careful not to make any noise. Her legs felt unsteady as she made her way back to her room, her hunger forgotten. The letter had been sitting in her trash can for weeks, crumpled but unopened. She'd even added other trash on top of it, as if burying it deeper would make it disappear. Sitting cross-legged on her bed, Zara stared at the letter she'd retrieved from the trash. The envelope was wrinkled now, the corners bent, but her name was still clearly visible in careful handwriting. Charles's handwriting, her grandfather's handwriting. Her fingers traced the letters of her name. What secrets did this envelope hold? What truths about her mother, about her family, about herself? The urge to rip it open warred with the fear that had kept it sealed all these weeks. In the end, she couldn't do it. Not yet. But instead of returning it to the trash, she opened her desk drawer. Pushing aside her perfectly organized school supplies, she placed the letter at the very back, then closed the drawer slowly. She wasn't ready to read it, but she wasn't ready to let it go either. The autumn morning was crisp and clear as Elliot's car glided through the city streets. Zara sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, trying not to show her growing suspicion. When Elliot had suggested a drive after breakfast, she'd agreed mostly to avoid another awkward conversation about Charles. But now, as they moved away from their usual routes, she felt her guard rising. "Where are we going?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Elliot's hands flexed on the steering wheel. "Just thought we could use some fresh air. There's a nice park not far from here." Zara studied his profile, noting the slight tension in his jaw. She'd gotten better at reading him over the past months, learning the little tells that gave away when he was nervous about something. Right now, those tells were screaming at her. The car turned onto a tree-lined street, leaves dancing across the pavement in shades of red and gold. They passed rows of modest houses until the road opened up to reveal a small neighborhood park. It wasn't anything special, just a few benches, some walking paths, and an old playground. But Zara's heart stopped when she saw the figure sitting alone on one of the benches. Even from a distance, she knew who it was. The proud set of his shoulders, despite his age. The careful way he held himself, like someone used to being watched. Charles Toussaint, her grandfather. "You tricked me," Zara said, her voice tight with betrayal as Elliot parked the car. "I didn't trick you," Elliot replied softly, turning off the engine. "I just gave you the choice to walk away or stay." Zara's hand gripped the door handle, ready to refuse this whole situation. But something made her pause. Through the car window, she could see Charles more clearly now. He wasn't the imposing figure she'd imagined from the old news articles she'd found online. Instead, he looked tired, vulnerable. His hands were clasped together in his lap, and every few moments, he would glance toward the car with an expression that made her chest hurt. "You don't have to do this," Elliot said gently. "We can drive away right now if that's what you want." Zara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. Part of her wanted to leave, to protect herself from whatever pain might come from this meeting. But another part, the part that had kept that letter in her desk drawer instead of throwing it away again, wanted to stay. "Okay," she whispered, more to herself than to Elliot. "Okay." They got out of the car slowly. The morning air was cool against Zara's face as they walked toward the bench. Charles stood as they approached, his movements careful and deliberate. Up close, she could see more of herself in him. The same dark eyes, the same way of holding tension in their shoulders. "Hello, Zara," he said, his voice rougher than it had been on the phone with Elliot. "Thank you for coming." Zara didn't respond, but she sat down on the bench, leaving space between them. Elliot quietly excused himself, walking a short distance away to give them privacy while staying within sight. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. Charles seemed to be gathering his thoughts, his fingers working together nervously. "Your mother," he finally began. "She used to love this park when she was little." Zara's head turned slightly, surprised by this opening. "We lived just a few blocks from here," Charles continued, gesturing vaguely toward the old houses. "Every Sunday after church, she'd beg to come here. She'd spend hours on those swings trying to go higher and higher, always reaching for something more." His voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness that made Zara's throat tight. She'd never heard stories about her mother as a child before. "She was so bright," Charles went on, looking out at the playground, "so determined. When she was about your age, she decided she wanted to learn computer programming. I was thrilled, thought she'd follow in my footsteps. But she had her own ideas. She wanted to use technology to help people, not just make money." He paused, his shoulders sagging slightly. "That's where we started to drift apart. I was so focused on success, on proving myself in a world that didn't want to make space for people who looked like us. I thought I knew best. I thought—" He shook his head. "I thought I could control her path, keep her safe by keeping her in my world." Zara sat perfectly still, absorbing every word. She'd never known any of this about her mother. "When she met your father," Charles continued, "I disapproved. He was passionate about social justice, about fighting the system. I saw him as a threat to everything I'd built. Instead of listening to your mother, instead of trying to understand what she saw in him, I gave her an ultimatum." He turned to look at Zara directly for the first time. "That was my biggest mistake. Not because I was wrong about him. He did end up leaving. But because I let my fear and pride destroy my relationship with my daughter. When she needed me most, she couldn't trust me anymore." The pain in his voice was raw and real. Zara found herself fighting back tears, thinking about her mother alone and afraid, too proud to reach out to her father, too hurt to trust him again. "I tried to help when she was arrested," Charles said quietly. "I hired lawyers, tried to prove her innocence. But she wouldn't see me, wouldn't let me visit. She'd learned too well from me about letting pride get in the way of love." A tear escaped down Zara's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but Charles had seen it. "I'm not telling you this to make you sad," he said gently. "I'm telling you because you deserve the truth. All of it. The good and the bad. I was wrong, Zara. Wrong to let my fear control my actions. Wrong to give up when your mother pushed me away. Wrong to not find you sooner." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photo album. "These are pictures of your mother growing up, stories about who she was before everything went wrong. They belong to you now." Zara stared at the album but didn't reach for it. Charles set it carefully on the bench between them. "No matter what you decide," he said softly, standing up, "I'm proud of you, Zara." She didn't respond, she didn't look up. But her hand moved slightly toward the photo album, her fingers just brushing its worn cover. Days passed in a quiet rhythm after the park meeting. Zara carried the photo album to her room, but didn't mention it again. Still, Elliot noticed the subtle changes in her behavior. Sometimes he'd catch her sitting on her bed, slowly turning the pages when she thought no one was watching. Other times, she'd stare out the window with a distant look, lost in thought. The album stayed on her nightstand, a constant presence that seemed to grow more significant with each passing day. Elliot noticed she'd occasionally trace her fingers over the spine while doing homework, as if drawing comfort from its mere presence. At school, Mrs. Henderson's history class brought an unexpected catalyst. The teacher stood at the front of the room writing "Family History Project" in large letters across the whiteboard. "This assignment," Mrs. Henderson explained, "will help us understand how personal stories connect to larger historical events. You'll research your family's background and create a presentation about how your ancestors' experiences shaped who you are today." Several students groaned, but Zara sat up straighter, her mind already racing. Her first instinct was to do something safe, maybe focus on the general history of her mother's hometown. But as she looked down at her notebook, Charles's face flashed in her mind. During lunch break, instead of joining her usual table, Zara slipped into the library. She found an empty computer and typed Charles Toussaint Tech Company into the search bar. The results were sparse at first, just fragments of old news articles and brief mentions in business journals. But as she dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Charles's company, Innovation Forward, had been groundbreaking in the early days of personal computing. They developed revolutionary software that made computers more accessible to average users. But somewhere along the way, the company's achievements had been quietly attributed to others. Larger corporations had absorbed their innovations without credit. Charles's name had been gradually pushed to the margins of tech history. Zara's fingers flew across the keyboard as she discovered more. She found an archived interview where a former employee described how venture capitalists had systematically withdrawn support from Black-owned tech companies in the 1980s. Another article detailed how Innovation Forward had been denied crucial patents despite being first to market with several innovations. The more she read, the more clearly she saw it, the same pattern that had affected so many others. Black entrepreneurs pushed out of leadership positions, their contributions minimized or erased entirely, their stories lost to a system that seemed designed to forget them. She thought about Charles sitting alone in that modest house carrying the weight of this erasure. She thought about her mother, whose story had almost been forgotten too. The parallel struck her hard, how history could make people disappear if no one fought to remember them. That evening, after dinner, Zara found Elliot in his home office. He was reviewing documents, his reading glasses perched on his nose. She hesitated in the doorway, gathering her courage. "What happened to his company?" she asked quietly. Elliot looked up, surprised but trying not to show it. He studied her face for a moment, noting the determination in her eyes. Then, without a word, he stood and walked to a large cabinet in the corner of the office. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a worn cardboard box. "I was wondering when you might ask about this," he said, setting the box on his desk. "Come here." Zara approached cautiously. The box was filled with carefully preserved newspaper clippings, old magazines, and what looked like company newsletters. "Let's find out together," Elliot said, pulling up a chair beside his own. Zara sat down, her eyes fixed on the box. Elliot reached in and pulled out the first article, a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1975 with the headline, "Innovation Forward Leads Computer Revolution." Charles's younger face smiled up from the photo, standing proudly in front of his company's first office. For the first time since learning about her grandfather, Zara was choosing to understand her past, not running from it, not fighting it, but actively seeking to know who she came from and what had been lost along the way. She reached for the article, her fingers gentle against the fragile paper. As she began to read, Elliot watched her face soften with interest and recognition. This wasn't just a school project anymore. It was her story, her legacy waiting to be rediscovered. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a quote from Charles in the article. "Technology should open doors for everyone, not just a select few." That's exactly what Mom believed too, isn't it? Elliot nodded, carefully pulling out another clipping. "Your mother learned that from him, even if they ended up taking different paths to the same goal." Together they began sorting through the box, piecing together the story of Innovation Forward's rise and fall. Each article, each photograph, each company memo was another thread in the tapestry of her family's history. For the first time, Zara wasn't just learning about her past. She was choosing to embrace it, to understand it, to make it part of who she was becoming. The evening light faded outside the office windows as they continued their exploration, but neither of them noticed. They were too absorbed in uncovering the truth that had been waiting all this time, hidden in a box of memories, waiting for the right moment to be found. The evening stretched into night as Zara and Elliot pored over the contents of the box. Old photographs spilled across the desk, showing Charles at various stages of his career, young and hopeful at company launches, confident at press conferences and finally weary in the last few images before his disappearance from public life. "Look at this," Elliot said, holding up a magazine article from 1982. Innovation Forward was the first company to develop user-friendly interface designs. They made computers accessible to everyone, not just tech experts. Zara leaned in, studying the grainy photos of early computer screens. The article praised Charles's vision of bringing technology to ordinary people. But as she read further, she noticed something odd. "This later article about the same innovation doesn't mention him at all," she said, comparing two clippings. "It credits some bigger company instead." Elliot nodded grimly. That happened a lot. The bigger tech companies would see what Charles was doing, then somehow end up with the credit and the profits. They found more examples as they dug deeper. Patents that mysteriously changed hands. Innovations that were independently discovered by larger companies just months after Charles demonstrated them. Bank loans that were suddenly recalled without explanation. "It wasn't just bad luck, was it?" Zara asked quietly, connecting the dots. "They pushed him out on purpose." "The tech world wasn't kind to black innovators," Elliot explained. "Still isn't in many ways. But back then, it was even worse. When Charles started getting too successful, too influential, they erased him," Zara finished, her voice hard with understanding. The next afternoon, Zara asked Elliot to drive her to Charles's house. This time, there was no hesitation when she knocked on the door. When Charles answered, she didn't wait for pleasantries. "Tell me about Innovation Forward," she said firmly. Charles blinked, surprised by her directness. That's all in the past now." "No, it's not," Zara insisted. "It's my history too, and I want to know everything." Something in her determination must have touched him because Charles's resistance crumbled. He invited them in, disappearing into another room. When he returned, he carried a dusty briefcase. "I kept everything," he admitted, opening it carefully. "Couldn't bring myself to throw it away, even when I wanted to forget." Inside were treasures, original blueprints for computer systems, handwritten notes about interface design, early product sketches. Charles's hands trembled slightly as he showed them to Zara. "This was our first major breakthrough," he explained, pointing to a detailed diagram. "We called it the Universal Access Interface. The idea was to make computers friendly, intuitive. Back then, most systems required complex commands. We wanted anyone to be able to sit down and just use it." As Charles talked, his voice grew stronger. The passion he'd buried for years came flooding back. He showed Zara prototype designs, marketing materials, award certificates, all carefully preserved despite his attempts to leave that life behind. 6 months after we unveiled this, Meditech announced an innovative new interface that looked exactly like ours, he said, the old bitterness creeping in. "They had deeper pockets, better connections. When we tried to fight it, they buried you," Zara finished quietly. Charles nodded. Bank loans disappeared. Investors pulled out. Suddenly, our patents were being challenged. The press stopped covering our launches. It was like we became invisible. Zara listened intently, taking mental notes. With each story, each document, each piece of evidence, her resolve strengthened. This wasn't just corporate history. This was her family's legacy being systematically erased. "I'm doing a project for school," she said suddenly, "about family history and how it connects to bigger historical events." Charles looked up from the papers. "Oh?" "I want to tell your story," Zara continued. "Not just what happened to the company, but why it happened. How the system was rigged against black innovators. How your work was stolen and erased." "Zara," Charles hesitated. "That's a complicated story. Maybe something simpler would be better for a school project." But Zara shook her head firmly. This is the story that needs to be told. If we don't talk about what really happened, nothing will change." The next day at school, Zara stayed after class to speak with Mrs. Henderson about her project proposal. The teacher listened carefully as Zara outlined her plan to document Charles Toussaint's contributions to computer technology and how systemic racism in the tech industry led to his erasure. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. That's quite an ambitious topic, Zara. Are you sure you want to take on something this controversial? Zara met her teacher's uncertain gaze steadily. Yes, I am. She thought about Charles, carefully preserving his life's work in a briefcase even as the world tried to forget him. She thought about her mother, who inherited his determination to fight against injustice. She thought about all the other innovators whose stories had been buried, whose contributions had been stolen, whose names had been erased from history. This isn't just about my grandfather, she said firmly. It's about making sure these stories don't stay hidden. Someone has to tell the truth. The morning of Zara's presentation broke clear and bright. She stood before her mirror, adjusting her navy blazer from Elliot. Her hands trembled slightly, but determination filled her eyes. Downstairs, Elliot paced the kitchen, repeatedly checking his watch. Is Charles still coming? He asked Mrs. Connors as she prepared Zara's favorite breakfast. He called twice to confirm, Mrs. Connors replied, serving pancakes. Over months, she'd grown protective of Zara, treating her like family. Zara barely ate when she came down. Her presentation notes sat beside her plate, though she'd practiced until the words were memorized. What if he backs out? She whispered. He won't, Elliot assured her, though sharing her worry. Charles had agreed to attend despite his fear of facing crowds after years of isolation. They arrived early at school, the auditorium filled with people for History Day. Classmates fidgeted with Civil War and World War II posters while Zara's presentation waited on her laptop. Decades of buried history. As time passed, Zara kept watching the entrance. No Charles. Elliot squeezed her shoulder supportively. Just before the principal began, the door opened. Charles appeared in an oversized old suit. Finding Zara, he gave a nervous nod. Emotion tightened Zara's chest. Despite everything, he'd come. When her turn arrived, Zara approached the podium confidently. Her first slide showed Innovation Forward's original team with Charles at center. This is about innovation, she began clearly, but also about erasure. History isn't always written by those who make it, but by those with power to erase it. She detailed Charles's achievements, groundbreaking designs, patents, his vision for accessible technology, then showed how larger companies systematically copied his work, how banks rejected his loans, how history gradually forgot him. This wasn't just competition, she explained, displaying graphs showing similar patterns affecting other Black entrepreneurs. This was maintaining a system where innovation only counted from certain people. Her classmates sat transfixed. Teachers leaned forward, captivated by corporate injustice. Charles sat rigid initially, but gradually relaxed. Pride flickered across his face when Zara showed reviews praising his company's breakthroughs. This isn't just history, Zara continued confidently. It's about recognizing patterns that persist. Progress means ensuring everyone can contribute ideas. She concluded with current tech diversity statistics, connecting Charles's experience to present challenges. We can't change history, but we can learn from it, do better, and remember those who paved the way despite erasure. Thunderous applause followed. Students viewed Zara with newfound respect. Teachers nodded approvingly, some tearful. Zara watched only Charles, who sat still, crying openly. He mouthed, "Thank you." Afterward, Charles approached her, hands trembling. "Your mother would have been so proud," he said emotionally. Something shifted inside Zara, a burden lifting. She'd felt torn between honoring her mother and embracing life with Elliot. Now she understood she didn't need to choose. That evening, Zara and Elliot sat quietly together. Feeling safe and certain, she leaned against his shoulder. "Thanks for not giving up on me," she said. Elliot smiled, embracing her. "Never." Zara retrieved a framed photo of her mother and placed it on the mantel beside a recent picture with Elliot. Past and present stood together in harmony. Some families form through blood, some through choice, the best through both. If you enjoyed the story of Elliot and Zara, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.